The passenger pigeon. A wild pigeon is an extinct species of pigeon that was endemic to North America. Its common name is derived from the French word passager, meaning passing by, due to the migratory habits of the species. The scientific name also refers to its migratory characteristics. The morphologically similar mourning dove was long thought to be its closest relative, and the two were at times confused. But genetic analysis has shown that the genus Patagioenas is more closely related to it than the Zenaida doves. The passenger pigeon was sexually dimorphic in size and coloration. The male was 39 to 41 centimeters in length, mainly gray on the upper parts, lighter on the underparts, with iridescent bronze feathers on the neck, and black spots on the wings. The female was 38 to 40 centimeters, and was duller and browner than the male overall. The juvenile was similar to the female, but without iridescence. It mainly inhabited the deciduous forests of eastern North America, and was also recorded elsewhere, but bred primarily around the Great Lakes. The pigeon migrated in enormous flocks, constantly searching for food, shelter, and breeding grounds, and was once the most abundant bird in North America, numbering around 3 to 5 billion at the height of its population. It was not always as abundant, and the population size fluctuated rapidly over time. A very fast flyer, it could reach 100 kilometers per hour. The bird fed mainly on mast, and also fruits and invertebrates. It practiced communal roosting and communal breeding, and its extreme gregariousness may be linked with searching for food and predator satiation. Passenger pigeons were hunted by Native Americans, but hunting intensified after the arrival of Europeans, particularly in the 19th century. Pigeon meat was commercialized as cheap food, resulting in hunting on a massive scale for many decades. There were several other factors contributing to the decline and subsequent extinction of the species, including shrinking of the large breeding populations necessary for preservation of the species and widespread deforestation, which destroyed its habitat. A slow decline between about 1800 and 1870 was followed by a rapid decline between 1870 and 1890. The last confirmed wild bird is thought to have been shot in 1900. The last captive birds were divided in 3 groups around the turn of the 20th century, some of which were photographed alive. Martha, thought to be the last passenger pigeon, died on September 1, 1914, at the Cincinnati Zoo. Our eradication of the species has been described as one of the greatest and most senseless extinctions induced by humans. Taxonomy. Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus coined the binomial name Columba macroeura for both a mourning dove and a passenger pigeon in the 1758 edition of his work Systema Naturae, wherein he appears to have considered the two identical. This composite description cited accounts of these birds in 2 pre-Linnaean books. One of these was Mark Catesby's description of the passenger pigeon, which was published in his 1731–1743 work Natural History of Carolina, Florida and the Bahama Islands, which referred to this bird as Columbus migratorius, and was accompanied by the earliest published illustration of the species. Catesby's description was combined with the 1743 description of the mourning dove by George Edwards, who used the name C. macroeura for that bird. There is nothing to suggest Linnaeus ever saw specimens of these birds himself, and his description is thought to be fully derivative of these earlier accounts and their illustrations. In his 1766 edition of Systema Naturae, Linnaeus dropped the name C. macroeura and instead used the name C. migratoria for the passenger pigeon, and C. carolinensis for the mourning dove. In the same edition, Linnaeus also named C. canadensis, based on Tuatua canadensis, as used by Mater Ange Brisson in 1760. Brisson's description was later shown to have been based on a female passenger pigeon. In 1827, William John Swainson moved the passenger pigeon from the genus Columba to the new monotypic genus Ectopistes, due in part to the length of the wings and the wedge shape of the tail. In 1906, Outram Bangs suggested that because Linnaeus had wholly copied Catesby's text when coining C. macroeura, this name should apply to the passenger pigeon, as E. macroeura. In 1918, Harry C. Oberholzer suggested that C. canadensis should take precedence over C. migratoria, as it appeared on an earlier page in Linnaeus' book. In 1952, Francis Hemming proposed that the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature secure the specific name macroeura for the mourning dove, and the name migratorius for the passenger pigeon, since this was the intended use by the authors on whose work Linnaeus had based his description. This was accepted by the ICZN, which used its plenary powers to designate the species for the respective names in 1955. Evolution. The passenger pigeon was a member of the pigeon and dove family, Columbidae. Its closest living relatives were long thought to be the Zenaida doves, based on morphological grounds, particularly the physically similar mourning dove. It was even suggested that the mourning dove belonged to the genus Ectopistes and was listed as E. carolinensis by some authors, including Thomas Mayobra. The passenger pigeon was supposedly descended from Zenaida pigeons that had adapted to the woodlands on the plains of central North America. The passenger pigeon differed from the species in the genus Zenaida in being larger, lacking a facial stripe, being sexually dimorphic, and having iridescent neck feathers and a smaller clutch. In a 2002 study by American geneticist Beth Shapiro et al., museum specimens of the passenger pigeon were included in an ancient DNA analysis for the first time, and it was found to be the sister taxon of the cuckoo dove genus Macropygia. The Zenaida doves were instead shown to be related to the quail doves of the genus Geotrigon and the leptotilla doves. A more extensive 2010 study instead showed that the passenger pigeon was most closely related to the New World Patagioenas pigeons, including the band-tailed pigeon of western North America, which are related to the Southeast Asian species in the genera Turrisona, Macropygia and Rhinewatona. This clade is also related to the Columba and Streptopelia doves of the Old World. The authors of the study suggested that the ancestors of the passenger pigeon may have colonized the New World from Southeast Asia by flying across the Pacific Ocean, or perhaps across Beringia in the north. In a 2012 study, the nucleo-DNA of the passenger pigeon was analyzed for the first time, and its relationship with the Patagioenas pigeons was confirmed. In contrast to the 2010 study, these authors suggested that the results could indicate that the ancestors of the passenger pigeon and its Old World relatives may have originated in the neotropical region of the New World. The cladogram below follows the 2012 DNA study showing the position of the passenger pigeon among its closest relatives. DNA in old museum specimens is often degraded and fragmentary, and passenger pigeon specimens have been used in various studies to discover improved methods of analyzing and assembling genomes from such material. DNA samples are often taken from the toe pads of birds' skins in museums, as this can be done without causing significant damage to valuable specimens. The passenger pigeon had no known subspecies. Hybridization occurred between the passenger pigeon and the Barbary dove in the aviary of Charles Otis Whitman, but the offspring were infertile. Etymology. The genus name Ectopistes translates as moving about or wandering, while the specific name migratorius indicates its migratory habits. The full binomial can thus be translated as migratory migratory wanderer. The English common name passenger pigeon derives from the French word passager, which means to pass by in a fleeting manner. While the pigeon was extant, the name passenger pigeon was used interchangeably with wild pigeon. The bird also gained some less frequently used names, including blue pigeon, Mernruck pigeon, wandering long-tailed dove, and wood pigeon. In the 18th century, the passenger pigeon was known as tourté in New France, but to the French in Europe it was known as tourte. In modern French, the bird is known as tourté voyageurs, a pigeon migrateur, among other names. In the Native American Algonquin languages, the pigeon was called a mimi by the Lenape, omiami by the Ojibwe, and mimia by the Kaskaskia, Illinois. Other names in indigenous American languages include oite in Mohawk, and Puchinashoba, or lost dove, in Choctaw. The Seneca people called the pigeon jagawa, meaning big bread, as it was a source of food for the tribes. Chief Simon Pokagon of the Potawatomi stated that his people called the pigeon omimiwog, and that the Europeans did not adopt native names for the bird, as it reminded them of the domesticated pigeons, instead calling them wild pigeons, as they called the native peoples wild men. Description: the passenger pigeon was sexually dimorphic in size and coloration. It weighed between 260 and 340 grams. The adult male was about 39 to 41 centimeters in length. It had a bluish-gray head, nape, and hindneck. On the sides of the neck and the upper mantle were iridescent display feathers that have variously been described as being a bright bronze, violet to golden green, depending on the angle of the light. The upper back and wings were a pale slate gray tinged with olive brown, that turned into grayish-brown on the lower wings. The lower back and rump were a dark blue-gray that became grayish-brown on the upper tail covert feathers. The greater and median wing covert feathers were pale gray, with a small number of irregular black spots near the end. The primary and secondary feathers of the wing were a blackish-brown, with a narrow white edge on the outer side of the secondaries. The two central tail feathers were brownish-gray, and the rest were white. The tail pattern was distinctive as it had white outer edges with blackish spots that were prominently displayed in flight. The lower throat and breast were richly pinkish rufous, grading into a paler pink further down, and into white on the abdomen and undertail covert feathers. The undertail covers also had a few black spots. The bill was black, while the feet and legs were a bright coral red. It had a carmine red iris surrounded by a narrow purplish-red eye-ring. The wing of the male measured 196 to 215 millimeters, the tail 175 to 210 millimeters, the bill 15 to 18 millimeters, and the tarsus was 26 to 28 millimeters. The adult female passenger pigeon was slightly smaller than the male at 38 to 40 centimeters in length. It was duller than the male overall, and was a grayish-brown on the forehead, crown, and nape down to the scapulars, and the feathers on the sides of the neck had less iridescence than those of the male. The lower throat and breast were a buff-gray that developed into white on the belly and undertail covers. It was browner on the upper parts and paler buff-brown and less rufous on the underparts than the male. The wings, back, and tail were similar in appearance to those of the male, except that the outer edges of the primary feathers were edged in buffer rufous buff. The wings had more spotting than those of the male. The tail was shorter than that of the male, and the legs and feet were a paler red. The iris was orange-red, with a grayish-blue, naked orbital ring. The wing of the female was 180 to 210 millimeters, the tail 150 to 200 millimeters, the bill 15 to 18 millimeters, and the tarsus was 25 to 28 millimeters. The juvenile passenger pigeon was similar in plumage to the adult female, but lacked the spotting on the wings, and was a darker brownish-gray on the head, neck, and breast. The feathers on the wings had pale gray fringes, giving it a scaled look. The secondaries were brownish-black with pale edges, and the tertial feathers had a rufous wash. The primaries were also edged with a rufous-brown color. The neck feathers had no iridescence. The legs and feet were dull red, and the iris was brownish and surrounded by a narrow carmine ring. The plumage of the sexes was similar during the first year. Of the hundreds of surviving skins, only one appears to be aberrant in color, an adult female from the collection of Walter Rothschild, Natural History Museum at Tring. It is a washed brown on the upper parts, wing covert, secondary feathers, and tail, and white on the primary feathers and underparts. The normally black spots of brown, and it is pale gray on the head, lower back, and upper tail covert feathers, yet the iridescence is unaffected. The brown mutation is a result of a reduction in eumelanin, due to incomplete synthesis of this pigment. This sex-linked mutation is common in female wild birds, but it is thought the white feathers of this specimen are instead the result of bleaching due to exposure to sunlight. The passenger pigeon was physically adapted for speed, endurance, and maneuverability in flight, and has been described as having a streamlined version of the typical pigeon shape, such as that of the generalized rock dove. The wings were very long and pointed, and measured 220 mm from the wing cord to the primary feathers, and 120 mm to the secondaries. The tail, which accounted for much of its overall length, was long and wedge-shaped, with two central feathers longer than the rest. The body was slender and narrow, and the head and neck were small. The internal anatomy of the passenger pigeon has rarely been described. Robert W. Schaffeld found little to differentiate the bird's osteology from that of other pigeons when examining a male skeleton in 1914, but Julian P. Hume noted several distinct features in a more detailed 2015 description. The pigeon had particularly large breast muscles that indicate powerful flight. The coracoid bone was large relative to the size of the bird, 33.4 mm, with straighter shafts and more robust articular ends than in other pigeons. The furcula had a sharper V-shape and was more robust, with expanded articular ends. The scapula was long, straight, and robust, and its distal end was enlarged. The sternum was very large and robust compared to that of other pigeons. Its keel was 25 mm deep. The overlapping uncinate processes, which stiffened the ribcage, were very well developed. The wing bones were short but robust compared to other pigeons. The leg bones were similar to those of other pigeons. Vocalizations: the noise produced by flocks of passenger pigeons was described as deafening, or audible for miles away, and a bird's voice as loud, harsh, and unmusical. It was also described by some as clucks, twittering and cooing, and as a series of low notes instead of actual song. The birds apparently made croaking noises when building nests, and bell-like sounds when mating. During feeding, some individuals would give alarm calls when facing a threat, and the rest of the flock would join the sound while taking off. In 1911, American behavioral scientist Wallace Craig published an account of the gestures and sounds of the species as a series of descriptions and musical notations, based on observation of C. O. Whitman's captive passenger pigeons in 1903. Craig compiled these records to assist in identifying potential survivors in the wild, while noting this meager information was likely all that would be left on the subject. According to Craig, one call was a simple harsh keck that could be given twice in succession with a pause in between. This was said to be used to attract the attention of another pigeon. Another call was a more frequent and variable scolding. This sound was described as kiki-kiki or tet, tet, tet. and was used to call either to its mate or towards other creatures it considered to be enemies. One variant of this call, described as a long, drawn-out tweet, could be used to call down a flock of passenger pigeons passing overhead, which would then land in a nearby tree. Keho was a soft cooing that, while followed by louder kek notes, a scolding, was directed at the bird's mate. A nesting passenger pigeon would also give off a stream of at least 8 mixed notes that were both high and low in tone and ended with keho. Overall, female passenger pigeons were quieter and called infrequently. Craig suggested that the loud, strident voice and degenerated musicality was the result of living in populous colonies where only the loudest sounds could be heard. Distribution and habitat. The passenger pigeon was found across most of North America east of the Rocky Mountains, from the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast in the east, to the south of Canada in the north, and the north of Mississippi in the southern United States, coinciding with its primary habitat, the eastern deciduous forests. Within this range, it constantly migrated in search of food and shelter. It is unclear if the birds favored particular trees and terrain, but they were possibly not restricted to one type, as long as the numbers could be supported. It originally bred from the southern parts of eastern and central Canada south to eastern Kansas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Georgia in the United States, but the primary breeding range was in southern Ontario and the Great Lakes states south through states north of the Appalachian Mountains. Though the western forests were ecologically similar to those in the east, these were occupied by band-tailed pigeons, which may have kept out the passenger pigeons through competitive exclusion. The passenger pigeon wintered from Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina south to Texas, the Gulf Coast, and northern Florida, though flocks occasionally wintered as far north as southern Pennsylvania and Connecticut. It preferred to winter in large swamps, particularly those with older trees, if swamps were not available. Forested areas, particularly with pine trees, were favored roosting sites. There were also sightings of passenger pigeons outside of its normal range, including in several western states, Bermuda, Cuba, and Mexico, particularly during severe winters. It has been suggested that some of these extraliminal records may be considered as such more on the basis of the paucity of observers in what was then unsettled country than on the actual extent of wandering passenger pigeons, and that the bird may have appeared anywhere on the continent except for the far west. There were also records of stragglers in Scotland, Ireland, and France, although these birds may have been escaped captives, or the records simply incorrect. More than 130 passenger pigeon fossils have been found scattered across 25 states and provinces of the United States, including in the La Brea tar pits of California. These records date as far back as 100,000 years ago in the Pleistocene era, during which the pigeon's range extended to several western states that were not a part of its modern range. The abundance of the species in these regions and during this time is unknown.